Decades ago, when I was doing undergraduate work at Colorado, a new president gave a speech on television upon his inauguration. And in that speech, he said, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country." Well, a lot of us at that time had just graduated from high school, and we were there under Cold War terms. We had fire drills, atomic bomb blast drills, nerve gas drills. We were always aware or made aware that the Russians are coming. We should be afraid of the Russians. And then when I started college, the fear came to a head when Russia sent up Sputniks. Well, there was a large backlash, or at least support for turning out scientists, engineers, etc., so that we could keep up with the Russians. The Cold War was heating up, and many of us were offered money to major in engineering or to study engineering and sciences, things like this. And it was a heyday for university education. They paid us well to go to college, which is quite the opposite of from what it is today. Anyway, my whole family consisted of engineers. A subdivision my father had, everybody there but one was an engineer, and he was a physician. So I grew up around scientists and engineers. My uncle was an engineer, a soil engineer. I had an aeronautical engineer in the family, various civil engineers, etc. And it was just assumed I'd study engineering or science when I went to a university. I came close after a day in engineering. I switched over to pharmacy because I had an interest in chemistry and a little bit in physics. My cousin got his PhD in high energy physics from Cornell, and the rest of my relatives were in some way involved in science study, except for my younger brother, who was a business major. The other thing is, things were very politically hot back then under the Eisenhower administration. The Birch Society was very prominent. The anti-communism in this country was running rampant. I remember in my hometown, a German scientist who taught in the engineering school at Fort Collins had his house broken into and his papers and books burned, and a cross fired up on his lawn because they thought he was a Nazi, and or maybe a communist, either one, but he was different. Now, that kind of environment, there's all kinds of change. There's subtle change. We had a group drop out of society that referred to themselves as beatniks. They read poetry, sat around playing chess in various coffee houses and cafes, and were essentially harmless. But mainstream America thought they were a threat to something and sort of tried to ostracize them. Now, all of this idealism that was generated by this President Kennedy caught hold of younger people at that time, and they volunteered for things like the Peace Corps, various other community projects. Their whole motivation base was that of altruism and helping others. It was sort of based on fundamental Christian values, and it overflowed into the colleges. Well, that president got assassinated and replaced by another one who wanted to carry on with the Voting Rights Act bill and his vision of great society. I was getting out of law school then, and I was a believer. A lot of us were believers. In fact, most of my law school class were believers. And the law school classes in general back then were fairly small. I think I had 60 in mine or something like that. And 10% of them already had law degrees from foreign law schools. We were schooled in human rights, rights of debtors, jurisprudence, equity, and mainly our jobs were conceived of looking out for the little guy, although we did have a large segment that went into corporate law, even though they had that mentality and organizational view. There was a war going on then in Vietnam, and a lot of my classmates from high school died in that war. Most of them went into the war. My younger brother was a pilot in that war and flew helicopters, HH-53. Later, what development on the HH-53 called a Pavlo. And with this sense of idealism, he was in air search and rescue, and the motto of his group was the rescue pilots existed, and they went out there in their machines, and they rescued pilots so that others may live. So their motto was, so that others may live. And that was sort of the general view of young people in those days. I'd had graduate work as a criminologist before I went to law school, and the undergraduate school and graduate institution that I attended had a master's degree in corrections, and the attitude there was we treat offenders as human beings and as assets to society, and the job was how to make them better assets rather than a drain on society. So we were turning out a whole bunch of people in the area of corrections, delinquency, things like this. It was a pretty good curriculum, actually. We studied the causation of crime, and it no longer exists. They don't care about corrections anymore. And that's one of the topics I want to get into on this series. When I first started practice, we were taught that a crime was an event involving people that was so egregious that the state, or in common law, the crown, had an interest. So if parties were in a dispute and somebody got injured, that was a civil matter, unless it was a matter in which the state should have an interest in the conduct of either of the parties. If there was an intent to do harm, that was a crime then. And the difference between Roman law or Napoleonic Code, or what they called civil law, and common law was the matter of intent. The lawyers that I grew up with, so to speak, and were in practice before I was, knew that you criminal law function on whether or not there was a belief that a person did something that was so bad that the state should interfere. And the whole concept of criminal law was predicated on the idea that you didn't judge people by their conduct, you judged them by their intent. In other words, was this a bad guy or not? And they had sort of a general bad guy theory in criminal law. So you had a lot of what you call screw-ups. that weren't criminals. And in fact, a judge a few years ago, after I'd practiced for 4 decades, was having a drink with me. And by then I was locally pretty well known, pretty well established. I had actually had jury trials on criminal cases in 30-some states, well traveled, and had probably defended over 1,000 people on various criminal activities, including organized crime, large-scale drug dealers, things like this. So we're having a few drinks, and the judge asked me, Dennis, in your career, how many real criminals have you represented? I said, well, I don't know, maybe. I just don't know. And he says, well, I bet you could count them on your 2 hands. I said, well, I had a lot of cases. And he said, well, I'm not talking about cases. I'm talking about how many criminals, actual criminals, have you represented? And he said, I want you to differentiate between a criminal and a screw-up. I think he used a different term than screw, but that gets the point across. And thinking about it, on reflection, that's true. I had very few really, really bad guys that I wouldn't want to go out and have a drink on a dark night with. And the rest of them were kind of screw-ups. In fact, if stupidity were a crime, that's probably where the majority of my clientele would be. So thinking about this, I really continued on my thoughts about what had changed since when I first started practicing law and now. And that was a big part of it. So going through notes over the last 50 years, I've come up with a few ideas that I'm trying to share with you at this point. One of the things was the Codification of Criminal Law. And I still don't understand how that came about. I can remember attending various lawyer functions, and that at one time, one major event caused a lot of change that a lot of us noticed, but didn't think was particularly harmful at the time, and that was the change of positions under the Nixon Administration. Now, I know a lot of my colleagues really got upset with the election of Richard Nixon and his announced crime programs and things such as this, because crime was always viewed as a local issue, a local matter, and there was some idea about unifying it throughout the United States and having some sort of basic due process rule what law should be or what law ought to be in various states. And a war started between states generally over the due process clause of the United States Constitution. And there was a jurisdictional battle going on between the states and the federal government. And it came to a head with the integration of schools and the calling of National Guard for integration. But there were other wars or battles being fought, one of which was the ability to define a crime. The other was what constitutes equal protection of the laws or what protects due process. One of the big jurisdictional cases was Mapp versus Ohio, where they determined what rules should apply to the states, all of the states equally under the due process clause. So it started to the law started to turn toward, we're going to have some baseline due process, and all criminal laws are going to have to adjust to that baseline. So you had confession rules like the Escobedo case and the Um, Cases around that, the Miranda case where you advise people of what their rights were. So you had the rights established by the Danny Escobedo case. And incidentally, that case was won by a colleague of mine that I knew and had referred cases to later on in practice, named Warren Wolfson. You had the Miranda case that was done by a colleague of mine that I'd tried a case with, named John Flynn. And I had the privilege of practicing or handling cases actually as co-counsel with a lot of these. In any event, you had Miranda and Mapp versus Ohio and all those cases saying here's the basic due process that should be applied across the country. Essentially, what those cases were telling the police is you can't slap the hell out of a suspect and get him to confess. And even if he does confess, you got to tell him that he doesn't have to confess and he can have a lawyer present and a few other things like that. The cops then started carrying cards around called the Miranda rights cards, and they would read them to defendants upon arrest. Like you have a right to counsel, you have a right to this, you have a right to that, etc. Well, this caused the right wing of the nation, the pro-police of the nation, to get real excited and worried about crime. And at that time, when Nixon got elected, he ran on a law and order platform. Now, to most of the people at that time, law and order didn't mean law and order. It meant we got to keep the blacks in their place and we can't let them get too much because it threatens our existence. And we don't want people like Martin Luther King going out there stirring these black people up, in the South particularly. And they ought to leave well enough alone. And if they want to do things, they shouldn't do it in such a way that it either destroyed property or people got hurt. So based or building upon this institutional racism, the Richard Nixon group sold the idea that we should maintain control over crowds and clamp down on First Amendment protests as much as we can before getting the notice of the courts and attorneys general and people like that. The other thing that was going on was more subtle. As the courts were trying to standardize procedures and due process rules among the states themselves wanted to have more uniformity in the criminal code. One of the seminars I took in graduate school in criminology was one about how do you define a crime and how do you get valid statistics, because you can't really measure crime unless you can have a valid statistic, and you needed a baseline for crime. Well, you had states like Louisiana, for instance, differentiated between grand theft and petty theft as $50. So anything above $50 was a felony, anything below wasn't. Some states, the line was $500, and there were numbers in between. So how could you compare the crime rates on theft in Ohio, for instance, and that in California? It was virtually impossible to get some sort of a guideline figure, particularly when they really didn't report the amounts of theft loss. And that's probably the best example, but there's other things like in the federal government, interstate transportation of a stolen vehicle. Well, if you stole a vehicle in Texas or Colorado or Alaska, you could drive forever and never cross a state line. You get on the East Coast with Delaware, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, etc. Places like this, you could drive and cross 3 or 4 state lines within a day. So you had more interstate transportation cases in the New York area, Baltimore area, Boston area than you did in, say, Denver, Cheyenne, Albuquerque, etc. This was a statistical nightmare for criminologists and a pretty big problem for legislators if they bothered to research a problem, which they generally didn't, but I'll get into that in another discussion. So I'm going to take a break. You guys should take a break. And the reason I'm doing this is I used to write things, but I don't type so well anymore. I've got a lot of things to say, a lot of things I want to get out there, and I would need a lot of discussion, and I wasn't getting it with my blog. I'll still publish my blog when I feel the urge, but I want to get as much information out there as possible by this method. I can't tell whether I'm getting through to anybody or not. The only way I can tell that is if there's feedback. And I think I would like feedback. I would like your ideas on what I should talk about. I'd like your ideas on how you respond to my ideas. If you think I'm full of shit, then write that and tell me. I don't know. Particularly with COVID, I'm so isolated lately. I don't have too many people to bounce ideas off of or get my thoughts straight with. So you can be a very integral part of this whole thing that I'm doing now. Please respond, and if you like what I'm doing, I'll refer this to other people. I'd like to get as many people watching this as possible. Thank you very much. Have a good day.